Owens Lake held water for 800,000 years. It took 13 to drain it. And for nearly a century after that, the exposed lakebed, 100 square miles of toxic salt flat wedged between the Sierra Nevada and the Inyo Mountains, produced the worst particulate air pollution ever recorded in the United States. 80,000 tons of poisonous dust every year. The fix was purely industrial. The city of Los Angeles was ordered to pump water back onto the lakebed, not to refill the lake, not to restore anything, but to stop the dust. Shallow flooding across geometric grids, saltgrass planted in laser-leveled rectangles, gravel blankets 4 inches thick. Nobody planted habitat, nobody released wildlife. The mandate was to meet federal air quality standards, and the budget was for dust control alone. Within months of the first water arriving, life followed. Algae bloomed in the warm shallows, flies hatched by the millions. And then birds came, over 100,000 in a single spring day, dropping out of the sky onto engineered ponds that, from satellite imagery, look like a circuit board pressed into the desert floor. Before 1913, Owens Lake was a 100-square-mile saline inland sea. Shallow, never more than about 50 feet deep, but vast enough to support commercial steamship traffic during the 1870s silver boom. The Bessie Brady, an 85-foot steamboat, hauled 30-ton loads of silver bullion from the Cerro Gordo mines across the water to the freight depots on the opposite shore. Towns lined the banks. Keeler, on the eastern edge, had 5,000 residents. Then William Mulholland built the Los Angeles Aqueduct. Completed in 1913, it captured the Owens River, the lake's primary source, and sent it 233 miles south to feed the growth of Los Angeles. Without its water supply, the lake collapsed. By 1926, 13 years after the diversion began, the entire body of water was gone. And then the dust started. The reason it was so severe comes down to the specific chemistry of the basin. Most dry salt flats, the Bonneville Flats in Utah for instance, are dominated by sodium chloride, ordinary table salt, which dries into a hard, stable crust. Owens Lake is fundamentally different. The minerals concentrated here over 800,000 years of evaporation are primarily sodium carbonate and sodium sulfate, the chemical fingerprint of the Sierra Nevada granite that weathered into the basin across that same time span. These salts don't form a hard surface, they crystallize into a soft, fluffy, powdery layer that sits on the ground like loose flour. And the lakebed keeps manufacturing fresh powder. The water table sits less than 10 feet below the surface. Groundwater wicks upward constantly through the clay, the same physics as a paper towel dipped in water. When that moisture reaches the surface and evaporates, it deposits another layer of powdery salt. In winter, the sulfate crystals swell as they absorb moisture, cracking and heaving the clay apart from the inside. In summer, they dry out and collapse into fine dust. The cycle repeats every year. The surface never stabilizes. When the valley's winds hit that powder, and they hit hard, funneling between the 14,000-foot Sierra Nevada and the 11,000-foot Inyo Range like air through a nozzle, the process is mechanical and violent. Heavier sand grains bounce along the surface, smashing into the soft crust like projectiles, and each impact launches clouds of microscopic particles into the atmosphere. Dust 10 times thinner than a human hair, loaded with arsenic, cadmium, and nickel that had concentrated in the basin over hundreds of thousands of years. 40,000 people live downwind. The dust storms, locals called them Keeler fogs, hit like weather events, emergency rooms filled with asthma crises and respiratory failures. Residents sealed their homes and installed hospital-grade air filters. One woman spent $8,000 on custom double-paned windows just to stop the dust from triggering hospitalizations. On Highway 395, the main road through the valley, the storms caused zero-visibility pileups. 90 miles south, the U.S. Navy's China Lake Weapons Testing Facility was forced to cancel flight operations repeatedly, each cancellation costing up to $50,000 because the dust threatened to score jet, turbines, and degrade targeting sensors. In 2001, air monitors recorded a 24-hour dust concentration of 20,750 micrograms per cubic meter. For context, the federal health limit is 150. That reading was 140 times the legal threshold, the highest particulate concentration ever recorded in the United States. For decades, LADWP refused responsibility. The water rights predated modern environmental law. A county air pollution officer named Ted Shade broke the deadlock. Using a California statute that allowed his district to hold the city financially liable for air pollution caused by its historical water diversions, Shade forced a legal confrontation that lasted years. In 1998, LADWP signed a binding agreement accepting full financial and operational responsibility for the dust, and construction began in 2000. But the city kept fighting, challenging the mandate in federal court even as it built the infrastructure. In 2012, a federal judge dismissed the lawsuit entirely, ending over a decade of legal resistance. The fix would ultimately cost $2.1 billion, and it required the same resource the lake had been drained to obtain. The cure for the dust was water. Starting in 2000, LADWP began building the largest single-source dust control project in North American history. 3 methods deployed simultaneously across 49 square miles of toxic lakebed. The primary weapon was water. Flows from the Los Angeles aqueduct were released across the lakebed in thin sheets pooling behind thousands of low earthen berms that divided the playa into manageable cells. Keep 75% of the surface wet during dust season and the powdery crust cannot form. If the crust cannot form, the wind has nothing to destroy. Where flooding wasn't practical, they planted saltgrass, a tough native species that survives in soil twice as salty as seawater, across laser-leveled blocks and irrigated it with controlled pulses. Once established, the dense mat of roots and stalks cuts wind speed at ground level and traps incoming sand before it can bounce into the crust. The third approach eliminated water entirely. A 4-inch layer of coarse gravel laid over a fabric membrane severs the connection between groundwater and the surface. No moisture reaching the top means no salt crystallizing. No salt means no dust. But nothing grows on gravel. Biologically, it's sterile ground. None of these measures were designed to create habitat. They were designed to hit a single regulatory number, 99% dust control efficiency. And by 2018, they had exceeded it. Peak dust readings dropped from 20,750 micrograms per cubic meter to 728. The annual days exceeding the federal limit fell from 49 to 8, a 96.5% reduction in peak pollution across nearly 50 square miles. For the first time in living memory, the air over the Owens Valley was close to clean. But in the shallow flood zones, the cells where thin sheets of water sat warming under the desert sun, maintenance crews started noticing things that had nothing to do with air quality. Plants they hadn't put there, insects they hadn't seen before, and birds. At first a few, then flocks, then thousands. A lakebed that had been biologically dead for the better part of a century was responding to the water within its first season. The engineering had been aimed at the atmosphere. It was quietly rebuilding something on the ground. When the shallow flood water settled across the alkaline clay, it created something that hadn't existed on this lakebed since 1926, a gradient. Near the inflow pipes, the water was relatively fresh. Further out, where it mixed with the ancient salt deposits, the salinity climbed. In zones where the concentration landed between 25 and 75 grams per liter, a narrow chemical window, conditions turned out to be perfect for massive blooms of algae, the kind that carpet any warm sunlit water that sits still long enough. They spread across the shallow flood cells, not in small patches, across square miles. The algae fed the next link. Alkali flies, a species built for exactly this kind of salty, mineral-heavy chemistry, colonized the flood cells almost immediately. Their larvae fed on the algal mats. The adults emerged by the millions, forming dense clouds along every waterline, an enormous concentration of food sitting right at the water's edge. The flies summoned the birds. The Pacific Flyway, a migratory corridor stretching from the Arctic tundra to South America, runs directly over the Owens Valley. For shorebirds making that 4,000-mile journey twice a year, the desert crossing between the Central Valley wetlands and the Great Basin is the hardest stretch. Almost no water, almost no food, almost nowhere to land. Before 1913, Owens Lake was one of the major refueling stops on that route. When the lake disappeared, the birds lost it. They had to fly the gap without stopping. Now suddenly, there was water again, warm, shallow, crawling with flies. American avocets, black-necked stilts, white-faced ibis, western sandpipers by the tens of thousands, eared grebes floating on the brine pools. The birds came down and they kept coming. Here's why the numbers were that large. The thousands of low earthen berms that LADWP had built to compartmentalize the flood zones purely for hydraulic control to keep water from draining to the center of the basin were creating something no engineer had calculated. Shoreline. Miles of it. Shallow edges where water meets mud, the exact transition zone that wading shorebirds need to feed. The engineered grid produced roughly 3 times more of this shoreline habitat than the original natural lake ever had. The geometry was human. What was living inside it was not. In April 2013, the Eastern Sierra Audubon Society conducted a lake-wide survey. The single-day count came back at 115,000 birds, including over 64,000 shorebirds from 20 different species, feeding and resting on the industrial dust control grid. From the air, the site looks like nothing that occurs in nature: rectangular ponds, straight-edged saltgrass blocks, gravel strips, maintenance roads between cells. But at ground level, standing at the edge of a shallow flood zone with thousands of avocets wheeling overhead and the Sierra Nevada filling the western sky, it looks like what the lake was trying to become again the moment water touched it. The National Audubon Society designated Owens Lake a nationally significant important bird area. In 2018, it was inducted into the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, an international designation reserved for sites supporting over 100,000 shorebirds annually. And the chain went one step further than visitation. The birds didn't just stop over, they nested. The western snowy plover, a California species of special concern, began breeding on the lakebed, 600 to 700 adults reproducing there every year, the single largest snowy plover nesting population in the entire state, on an industrial dust control grid, built by a water utility under court order. That nesting crossed the project into a completely different legal domain. California's Fish and Wildlife Agency asserted jurisdiction. LADWP is now required to maintain a minimum of 1,000 acres specifically for shorebird habitat and sustain a baseline breeding population of at least 272 snowy plovers, regardless of which dust control method is deployed on the surrounding lakebed. An engineering program built to satisfy clean air law is now simultaneously bound by wildlife conservation mandates that did not exist when the first water was pumped. From 80,000 tons of airborne poison per year to 115,000 birds in a single spring day. Peak dust down 96.5%. An internationally recognized shorebird reserve built on the most polluted surface in American air quality history. Every link in that chain, algae to flies to birds to legal mandate, depends on one thing: water. The shallow flood zones that sustain the algae, the flies, and the birds consume up to 51% of all the fresh water LADWP has available in the Owens Valley during drought years. The city has spent $2.1 billion on this project and is actively converting flood zones to waterless methods, gravel blankets, mechanical tillage, to cut that consumption roughly in half. Every acre that transitions from shallow water to dry control is an acre the birds lose. The Sierra Nevada snowpack that feeds both the aqueduct and the dust control ponds is shrinking. Temperatures across the basin are rising. Evaporation is accelerating. The water the Oasis depends on is the water the city depends on, drawn from a source that is getting smaller. 800,000 years of water, 13 years to drain it, nearly a century of dust. And the speed at which the biology returned, algae in weeks, flies in months, birds within the first season, is the most striking data point in the entire $2.1 billion project. The lakebed was not dead. It was waiting. The transformation is real. Snowy plovers nesting on ground that once produced the highest particulate reading in the country. The Oasis exists because a city keeps paying for water it is simultaneously trying to stop using. Its permanence is not guaranteed. The lake held water for 800,000 years. It was drained in 13. And the life that came back, uninvited, unplanned, unbudgeted, depends on whether the water keeps coming. One intervention, aimed at dust, and the desert took the water and built a food web out of it, algae to flies to birds to legal mandate, in a chain no engineer drew on a blueprint. The system didn't need a restoration plan, it needed the surface wet. Everything else it built on its own. If that kind of cascade interests you, how one fix placed at the right point unlocks consequences far beyond the original scope. That is what this channel is about. Subscribe, and we will see you on the next one.